Hey guys, this is Mark. In this lecture, we will be discussing the implementation of the user login functionality for your applications built with UI Builder and Backendless. User login is one of the very first experiences that a user would have with your application. And it's probably one of the most important one because establishing the identity of the user is a starting point for most of the operations that really fall out in the actual app. Once you know who the user is, you know what data to load for that user. The system will remember what objects and data records were created by that user. So most of the use cases that will exist in the application are going to be related to that user. So establishing their identity is quite important. Of course, there are some side use cases such as logging in as a guest user. Like for instance, when you start with a shopping cart, you may not necessarily want the user to authenticate themselves and tell them who they are unless they want to. In most of the cases, a user may just add items to a shopping cart, and by the time they get to checkout, you may ask, would you like to create an account? And then if so, they will create an account. So that's sort of like a guest user login. But in today's lecture, we're talking about the actual real login of a registered user. And the actual process of login is very simple in its nature. It really is a matter of verifying user credentials and making sure that they are who they say they are. And once the user is established, then the actual app on the client side will know who that user is. And then for all subsequent API operations, like whenever you save something in the database in your app where there is a logged in user, or you retrieve data, the identity of that user is passed back and forth between the client and the server to identify who that user is on the server side. So when you save an object in the database, that information about who the user is goes to the server, and the server says, oh, I know who that user, and then the objects that are being saved in the database, for instance, will be marked as the created by such and such user. I'm getting a little bit more technical than I wanted to, but these are very important concepts, and we'll be coming back to them when we start reviewing database integration. So a lot of magic will happen when you just log in a user, because what really happens is the client-side environment will just remember who that user is and will do a lot of groundwork for you to mark every single API request with that user's identity. So that happens automatically. And in today's lecture, in the demo that we will create, we will just consider a very basic use case of logging in a user and then just making sure that we get to the information about that user. It's going to be as simple as this. But as you progress and as you do additional exercises and in other lectures that follow, you will see that the whole concept of user authentication is huge. Because in addition to just the basic login, email-based login and password, there is a phone-based authentication. There is authentication through third-party providers such as login with Facebook, login with Twitter, login with LinkedIn, and so on. So it's a complex subject, but we got to start somewhere. So let's start with just basic email address-based login and password. See you in UI Builder. Now that we are in UI Builder, let's create a new page and call it the login page. And it could just be created from the landing page template, login page. And to keep things very simple, let's just add two input components. One will be for the identity, which is the email address, and a button that will say login. So just change the label for the button, login. So this one will be email address, and this will say password. And change the type to be password as well. So this is as simple as it gets for the login form. What you might want to do is to center the content if you'd like. It will look something like this. That will also work. The login with email address and password is perhaps the most simple because it requires only two parameters. In most of the cases, the identity of the user is done through the email address. If you change the identity to some other property, then you will be gathering that property that will serve as identity. But the API call that is sent to the server to authenticate the user takes the identity value and the password. That API call, if it is successful, will return back a complete user object that contains all the properties that exist in the database for that user. The only property that is not returned is the password, because the password is going to be encrypted, it is hashed, so we cannot get to the actual raw password. What we can do is we can verify the password by applying the same algorithm that we apply to make sure that they entered it correctly, but to get the actual password, it is impossible. So once again, if the login API is successful, we get the backendless user object back. And in our case, what we will do, we will just stay with one page for now, and the login button will authenticate the user. If the login is successful, we will just greet the user by name right here on the same page. If the login fails, then we will display an error that is returned by the server. So in order to make this happen, let's add a text component right here, and let's give it a little bit of a margin on the bottom, let's say 10 pixels. This text component could have the data binding for the value to, once again, status message, very similar to what we did for the registration page. And this text component by default will not be visible. The idea of it is the status message text. Okay. Now let's establish data binding for the email address and password. Click on the logic for the email address. The value will be bound to the email property, and the password will be bound to the password property. At this point, we're ready to implement the login functionality. So click the login button and go to logic for the login button, and then in here in the onClick event, click the button to add logic. In here, we just need to get the user ID and password, and the user ID is going to be email. And we could just put those values directly into the API call. The API call to log in, if you go under backendless in the users API, you see a bunch of blocks because the users API is really huge. The one you want to use is this one. You see it says login user, and it takes two parameters, identity and the password. It'll stay logged in. Ignore that for now. We'll get to it in the next lecture. So drag it out here. Right click. I always like to change it to external values because it seems to be more compact. There is a checkbox to return user. Let's not return user yet, because here we just want to handle the login. The stay logged in parameter can be changed to false for now to keep things simple. So for identity, go to object and get property. The property will be email because of the data binding, and it will be in page data. And for the password, the data binding property was password, once again in page data. This will take care of user login. Of course, there is no logic for error handling yet. Nothing happens on the page when you click the button. If the login is successful, then everything else will stay the same. So what we are going to do is let's add some error handling in here, and then move this into the try block. So if there is an error, then we will notify the user of the error. And to make this happen, we will set the property in page data. I accidentally dragged this out here, so let's delete it. And then the property will be status message. And in here, let's compose the actual error. Login failed. Server returned an error. And then the actual error will be a property in the error variable. I don't think we've done it yet, but that's how it will work. So the property will be, I think it is called message. And if it is not message, we will correct it. And the second parameter will be error. So what happens here, if login fails, then there is an error that we catch this error and we compose an error message for our text where we take the actual message returned by the server and we display it to the user. And let's keep this print error. However, if login is successful, we also want to compose that text, the status message. And in here, what we will do, actually, let's keep it like this. And say user logged in, and we say hello, and then we get the property name of our user, not the error, but the user. So at this point, the question is, how do we get the user? Well, if login is successful, there is actually a block that returns currently logged in user. If you go to users API, you see this block, get current user. So from this current user, we can get any property. And in this case, we will just greet the user by name. That's all the logic we're going to have. And let's see how well that works. Before we actually run this page, let's go to the backend, because I think I was testing it with some users. So these are the users that we created previously. This is me that I was running a few tests with. I'm going to delete these users. And what I will do is I will go to the registration page first and run that to create a user. So the user will be Mark. The email address is mark@backendless.com. My super secret password. Click register. User registration is successful, so the user is there. Now I'm switching to the login page so we can test our new functionality. Let's run it, and I will be logging in with the same credentials that I used in the registration a second ago. Click login. So since we're not getting a result, more than likely there is an error. So let's go into inspect and select console. And as you can see, there is no errors here, and I know exactly what's going on. So what's going on is we actually were able to log in this user, and we set the status message, but our text component is invisible. And in our logic, we never changed the visibility to be true. So to fix this bug, let's turn on visibility of our status message text and set it to be visible. Same thing when an error happens. There you go. So that was the bug. And once again, the reason I want to keep this in the video is because you might be running in something similar. So in this case, I didn't have to use any logging. I was just thought about what happened. I know I could see that there is an API call made. The user is successfully logged in, but nothing happens. So obviously it has something to do with the logic in the actual UI. Let's rerun this page. And let's log in that user. Click login, and it says user logged in, hello Mark. So as you can see, the login worked just fine. Now, if I were to, let's try reload this page and see what happens when the login is not successful. So here, I'm just going to type in some bogus password, click login, and that's what we get. Login failed, so return an error, and this came back from the server. So in this case, you can see that how we handle both successful login and failed login. The most important thing, besides just how to handle the login that I would like you to learn, is that you get this block get current user. And then if there is no current user, meaning that if the user is not logged in, this one will return null. So you can use the conditional logic to check this block. But if the user is logged in and immediately after the login and then further down in the actual application logic, you can keep coming back to this block to get the information from the user. What properties can you get from the user object? Well, it really depends on your application. So if you go to backend and select the users table and go to schema, so all these column names are the properties. So this is what becomes available to you. Okay. So for instance, if I wanted to get phone number of that user, if that data is there, Then I just do get property, phone number of the current user, and I get that value. Same thing for relations. So when the user object has relational data to some other data table, you can retrieve it as well. That's all, guys, that I have planned for you for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. And as always, happy codeless coding.